Yeah, so Adam Smith was the self-interest guy, right? So it's all about pursuing your own self-interest, and in the pursuit of your own self-interest, the public's interest will be served. And Nash said incomplete, right? Did he say he was wrong? No, he said he was incomplete. What's the distinction there? He was on the right track, but there was kind of more to the story, right? There might be kind of some special circumstances where self-interest might work a little differently than what they had, than the way it had been thought of up to that point. And so, what was? I guess you kind of said it. What was the scene there with the choices being made and how that could be contrary? What was the extra thing that he kind of brought into the picture? What's that?
Don't even talk to someone, go for a friend.
Yeah, go for the friends only. So the two, if we start, we're going to lay out how we kind of model this in economics, is what we're going to be getting into. But there's choices and there's outcomes, right? And so if their outcome, knowing that they were competing with each other in a sense, knowing where the outcomes would be and kind of predicting that path, having a set of choices, there was a better choice that led to a better outcome for all. And the key that makes it work is that had each one operated individually, it kind of ruins it for that person too. So the one guy made the comment, one of his buddies, if this is somehow some trick for you to get the blonde, then you can go to heck, or whatever he said in there. So he didn't know if they were tricking, but that wasn't Nash's point. He thought that there could be true cooperation, I guess, with the choices to get a better outcome. And that is this interdependence that we're introducing in this chapter, how choices can be interdependent, and you need to take that into account in some cases, so that it's not just me choosing what's best for myself, but thinking about how if others in this situation make choices, it's going to cause a different outcome for me. And so if I take that element into account, I can make better choices up front. It's strategic behavior, like we left off with last time on Wednesday, I guess it was. We had our big 4-day break. Okay, any other questions or comments on that? All right, so he was pretty influential to this. So let me kind of recap a little bit on oligopoly. We did the kink demand curve, and I kind of left you with that particular model, leaving us somewhat empty, not being very rich with the insights that it gives us into behavior of firms in this type of setting. So what were the three characteristics again of oligopoly? Few firms. So we just have a few firms. Now, generically, we might just call these agents, but it's kind of sticking with the idea of the business. There's just a few businesses in there. More generically, when we're talking about the buddies in the bar, each one of those is an agent, right? An economic agent, an economic actor. All right, so we just have a few firms, and how big's a few? We don't know. We're not saying small enough so that they can be interdependent. So that one person's choice depends on the others. So, this definition of few, is it 1, is it 2, is it 10? I don't know. We don't have an answer for that. But let's just put a small enough number such that there is interdependence of choices and outcomes, which we call payoffs. All right, good. So we had a few firms. Number 2. Yeah, so it didn't matter on the product. So we had the homogeneous good or heterogeneous good, or differentiated. Hetero, it doesn't matter. So the type of good doesn't matter. So a homogeneous good, probably the classic example that we'll read about and learn about, is oil. Saudi Arabia's oil is no different than American oil, for that matter, or Chile's oil once it goes through the refining process. Oil is a homogeneous good, but we have a few agents that might have the opportunity to act strategically with what they do. Heterogeneous good. We talked about a few last time. What are some real-world examples of some heterogeneous or differentiated goods? Hamburgers, possibly. Okay, so we got the hamburgers, although with hamburgers, we got to be careful. That's an example of a heterogeneous good for sure, but not necessarily a good that fits into an oligopoly structure. That might be monopolistic competition, but it is an example of a heterogeneous good. What about something where there's a few firms producing a heterogeneous good? Smartphones, yeah. So the actual manufacturers of the smartphones. We've got some of the biggies here, of course, HTC, Apple, who else? Samsung, LG, Motorola. I'll put a few more dots, but there's not a million different kinds. We've almost got the list. Probably the major players is a list of 10 or less, probably, with world sales of smartphones. Okay, so that's good. And then finally, what's number 3? Barriers to entry. Barriers to entry. What kind of barriers? What are some barriers to entry in the market in general that you guys got tested on even here over the weekend? Because we saw this in Monopoly being barriers to entry. Natural barriers like, give me an example. Different. Well, I want to stick with somebody mentioned up natural barriers. What did you mean by that? I think you could take a couple different directions. Jeff?
Like utilities and water.
Okay, so utilities, so that creates a natural monopoly. Is that what you're... Now, with the natural monopoly, it was kind of natural for firms for the market, the free market, to kind of gravitate towards there only being one firm because costs were going down over time. And so it seemed like if we can have one big firm, then we can potentially offer this product at a low cost. So the utilities might be an example. Think about, this is something that you guys probably don't think about unless you start getting into construction and some other things of how expensive it is to bring power to every home, to bring electricity. If you just buy a 50-foot run, I just did a little wiring at my house, and I bought a 50-foot run of wire to go from my box to this flooring that I did that I needed a new run. It was $26 for 50 feet. And then imagine bringing the big power from the power company all the way to each individual house. Now imagine if we had multiple power companies that were competing with each other, and each one had to run special lines all over the town to get it. We're talking millions and millions of dollars, even in just a little town like Ottawa, to pull that off. And so it's natural to allow one firm to do it. Now, what keeps one firm in there, though, tied in with the natural monopoly, which is essentially another barrier to entry? The government, yeah. The government regulation is one thing that creates a barrier to entry. So they might choose to monitor that one company or whatever. So we got into those sorts of barriers. What was another type of barrier to entry that the government grants? Patents. So a patent, you can have a monopoly on the way you design this specific product for 17 years. So that can create a barrier to entry. What else? Actually, when you said natural, I thought you were going a different direction. Another barrier can be natural resources. Can sometimes create a barrier to entry. Imagine if you, in order to produce some product, maybe I should try a real life one instead of making something up, but if you had a product that you had to be at a certain altitude and only the highest mountains in the world could get you to physically being up in in that space. Well, there's only so much real estate, and whoever owns the mountain has kind of exclusive rights to that particular production process. Similar things might be with an ocean. If we have some sort of marine activity of some sort, there might be a natural barrier to entry of getting in if you control that resource. A kind of an interesting case is, what is it called, Colton? Anybody familiar with how you make the smartphones? The product that goes into it? There's something in these that requires a special compound called coltan, I think it's called. And it's only found in some rare places in Africa, I think, and where the mines are, and it's been kind of subject to corruption, and so Apple needs that particular product, and so there's been some issues there. If you have access to that product, then you've got maybe a natural barrier to entry through natural resource. Okay, so there's one we haven't mentioned that's another barrier to entry. Anybody remember another one off the list?
Legal.
What's that?
Legal on it?
Legal, like if it's illegal, or yeah, that would be one. That's not the one I was thinking of. Whether something's legal or not can be a barrier to entry. So pot, all of a sudden, made it a little easier to become a dealer in Colorado because it's now legal. So we've reduced a barrier to entry. Good. It's kind of related to competition, but it's not. The competition itself isn't a barrier. We want to think about what's keeping those firms from competing. If you want to start up an airplane business, what might you find? The cost. Yeah, just the high startup cost can create a barrier to entry. So how many people are familiar? I happen to have my Berkshire Hathaway shirt on today. I went to the annual meeting last year. Dr. DeWald got some free tickets from, actually it was from Dr. Moore, our finance professor. And we went to the Berkshire Hathaway. Who's the primary owner and controller of Berkshire Hathaway? Warren Buffett, yeah. And he was on the second wealthiest list right under Bill Gates. It pretty much has gone Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and then the rest of the list. I just happened to see an article on that. There was 2 or 3 people from Kansas that were in there. The 2 co-founders are both on the billionaire list, like in the 200, ranked 200 or something. I can't remember how many billions they had, but that started the Garmin. Have you guys seen the Garmin industry, the Garmin factory there? So those 2, both of those co-founders were on the top 400 list of the wealthiest people. And then, of course, we have the Koch brothers is kind of an interesting group out of Wichita, if you're familiar with the Koch Industries. How many people from Wichita do we have in here? Usually got a few. So the Koch brothers each had 32 billion. And since they're brothers and they kind of work together, those 2 brothers each had about 30 something. And so those 2 added together went over Bill Gates, which is kind of an interesting dynamic, I thought. If you take the 2 Koch brothers, add them together, not, self-interested behavior, they do their own thing with their own money, but obviously they act jointly in some cases too. So, so the high cost of entry, there might be some industries where we only have a handful of people who can afford to get in there. And where I was going with Warren Buffett is, at this meeting, he kind of alluded to that part of what his competitive advantage is his pile of money. That when the economy goes into a tailspin and goes down, he likes to buy low and sell high. If you're going to buy a company here and sell it here, if it's a real big company that's having troubles, there's not too many people that can reach into a pile of cash besides that he has to buy that company at the right time. And so that creates a natural barrier for other people to pick up that company if you just can't, you don't have the money, because a company was worth 40 billion, and then it dropped in price. It's a bargain price at 35 billion, but who the heck's got 35 billion to pick it up, right? Only a few people have that, maybe that kind of those resources to get into it. So those are the key barriers to entry that we see in this. And so especially with this industry, I found over the years, it's important for you to remember the interrelationship, especially of these two, because we start to get confused possibly with fast food hamburgers. Is that oligopoly or is it not? It could be possibly if they have some discretion in a small town, if there's only a couple restaurants, they might be acting strategically, even though in a different market, it might be more monopolistic competition. So there tends to be kind of some overlap sometimes, and it's important to keep these primary characteristics kind of burned into your head. All right, so let's do a little John Nash here game theory. Let's do an example. So this is back to game theory now. If you guys had it in here, game theory. I defined it last time, and if I had to put a little title here on this example. So suppose there are two firms, Coke and Pepsi. Two firms, Coke and Pepsi. Each firm is deciding on an advertising budget. An advertising budget for next year of high or low. All right, so let's see. Zach, I don't think if I stay here, can you pretty much see the board over to here?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to write this up here. So we're going to put the situation into a box, four-square thing called a payoff matrix. And so first thing we do is we identify who the players are in the game. And here we've got Coke and Pepsi. Coke and Pepsi. And each player is trying to establish their choice or what they want to do. Coke can go high or low, and Pepsi can go high or low. You did this in biology a little bit? Okay. All right. If Coke goes high and Pepsi goes high, then each one of them will make $20 million. So the first entry of 20 is Coke's payoff or profit, and the second entry is Pepsi's profit or payoff. And that's if they both go with a high advertising budget. Now, if they both go with a low budget, so instead of going with, let me think here. Who's my star? Give me a star. Give me a, who? LeBron. All right, so we can go with LeBron. So Cokes and Pepsi are doing a high advertising budget. Both of them are chasing after LeBron or maybe Kobe or somebody like that, right, to be the endorser. If they instead both go after, well, since you brought it up, who's in basketball in here? Is anybody? Logan and Joe? All right. So instead, they decide to go after Logan and Joe if they go with the low. Now, how do you think that compares? How do you think that compares going with the Braves advertising budget, spending-wise, versus LeBron and Kobe up here? You think they can pick up those two guys for a little bit? Are you guys willing to take less than $1 million? Could we beat you up and get you down? Could we beat you up and get you down to $100,000 for just doing this endorsement, or could we beat you up a little bit more and get you down to 1,000 or something? I don't know. So you can imagine we can go a little bit lower. And so if they go with the low budget, if each company goes with the low budget, then Coke will make $50 million, and so will Pepsi. If both companies go with the Braves budget, the Brave advertising budget, and there's nothing wrong with the Brave advertising budget. Obviously, you can see they like it. They're making $50 million instead of 20, right? So there's no harm there. Now, the fear comes in, though, is if Coke goes with LeBron and Pepsi goes with Logan, then Coke gets $100 million, no offense, Logan, and Pepsi loses a lot of business. They get 0. Meanwhile, if Pepsi goes with Kobe and Coke goes with Joe, then Coke ends up not doing so hot and gets 0 profits, and Pepsi gets $100 million. All right, so that's our story here. And the first thing I want to make sure we do is define what these parts are of the pieces. So again, Coke and Pepsi are the agents or the players. These are the economic agents or players, Coke and Pepsi. This is the economic model, by the way. What we've just drawn, notice we've kind of gotten away from the old supply and demand. You might be happy to see that we're not doing this style. This is the economic model right here. And so we've got the agents, and then we've got their choices. Whoops. We got their choices, which also can be called their strategies as we start to get a little more complicated. So choices, strategies. With this particular game here, it's kind of making a one-shot choice and you're done. So it's not much of a strategy maybe, but we refer to it that way. All right, and then the whole box here is called the payoff matrix. The whole box is called the payoff matrix. And then within each cell, we always have the first agent is the agent over here to the left. So that's Coke's payoff. And then over here we've got the agent that's listed up top. In this case, it's Pepsi's payoff. And in this case, our payoff was profit. Okay, questions on the setup at all? All right, so where do we go? How does this game end? What do the companies do? Communicate?
And then he's maybe legal to say like, hey, if you go low, we'll go low.
Okay, good, good. So communicate would be a great idea, but in the United States we have these things called antitrust laws. So one of the things we look at is the rules of the game. What are the rules of the game? So let's put on kind of a new list here. Rules of the game. Now, does it make a difference if we allow the players to cooperate or they have to be competitive, which we call non-cooperative? So is it important if this is a cooperative game or a non-cooperative game? Does that make a difference? Where do we end up, do you think, if it's cooperative? Lower right. Okay, so if they can work together, we might get... Now, do you think that's guaranteed if we allow them to cooperate? So this is a bit of what John Nash was talking about in the video opening up, right? If we cooperate, we can get a better outcome than if we don't cooperate, was kind of the gist of it. That this could be potentially an outcome that could occur with cooperation. But is it guaranteed if we allow the companies, if it's not illegal through antitrust laws for the companies to work together, are we assured that this is going to be the outcome? What might they do? Jeff?
Well, I mean,
Or go ahead.
they can do whatever they want, so you can't assure that's the outcome, but it also doesn't protect the consumer.
Okay.
Because if they're cooperating, then they can increase their profits by.
All right, so let's for the moment anyway not worry about the consumer. Are we going to get that outcome? Or what might happen? Whether it's real world or not. You're going to say you're going to go low, and at the end of the day, this is my competitor. I'm going to screw you over, right? And cheat on the agreement. So even in a situation where we allow cooperation, we might make the prediction that there won't be cooperation. That's kind of an interesting element to this, is that we might allow cooperation, but that might not necessarily assure us that we're going to get here if people can cheat. Now, in the real world, if cooperation's allowed, what would these two companies be doing to get this solution? Sign a contract, right? So then if we have a rule of law where contracts are binding and you can take somebody to court if there's damages, then we might have something to go. So companies spend a lot of money, a lot of legal money with attorneys and whatnot to draft up contracts to make them binding in situations where they are allowed to cooperate or hire different people. So that's kind of where contracts come into play, because they found over the years that, boy, the good old days of a handshake are great, but the bigger the stakes, the bigger the things, we've kind of found that every once in a while, maybe the handshake's good 90% of the time, but do you want to have to declare bankruptcy because of the 10% chance you took for not doing a contract? So even good old boys might do a little bit in writing with the as a handshake. But as you've done maybe more and more business, reputation might play a role. All right, so rules of the game. First, is the game cooperative or non-cooperative? And the big econ word that we're using is collusion. Can agents collude? In other words, can they work together? So whether it's by law or by otherwise, we're going to have either a cooperative or non-cooperative game. With the context I've got here, following antitrust laws of the United States, let's say that we've got a non-cooperative game with this example that I'm doing here. So now we've got a non-cooperative game. I come to you again and I say, what's the outcome? What do you expect? What's your prediction given a non-cooperative game on this one? Both going to go high. Why do you say that?
Because that's the safe bet. You're still at least going to get 20 mil out of it. Otherwise, if you go low and the other competitor goes high, you're going to lose money. And they're going to make a lot more than you.
Okay, so if you go low, you might have a choice. So what, using these numbers, why don't you kind of restate in the words what you're thinking?
If you go high, you're at least you're maximizing the chance of making money.
Okay, so you'll be on the positive side for sure, right?
Right.
Because we got a 20 and 100, and then down here our outcomes, depending on what Pepsi does, is either 0 or 50. Okay? All right, other thoughts? Does it make a difference if we play this game 100 times? So in other words, this is the first round. And then we're going to do it again, and again, and again, and again. So every month, let's say, we're going to play it, or every 2 weeks or whatever. So this game's gonna be played over the course of 2 years. Does that change the outcome?
Is it with the same company?
Yeah, same 2 companies playing this game more 100 times. Payoffs don't change, the payoffs are the same. It's just like kind of, again, remember this is economic model, so we're not allowing too many moving parts. Like this is what we have to analyze. If we play it 100 times, what might change? Okay, start to make some predictions on the other company. Zach, did you have something, or you were just stretching? Jenna, what were you thinking?
I mean, it changes because if you get like 0 one time, then you play, you might get 100 the next 3 times.
Okay, good. So it changes the balance of things a little bit, right? Is that we might be willing to roll the dice a little bit, and so you know, maybe one person goes to 50, and then the other didn't play 50, but they're like, oh, that's only 100. We still got 99 more times to play. Maybe they'll get the picture, wink, wink, that, hey, I'm willing to play ball and hire the Ottawa guys if you are, right? And so then they're like, oh, yeah, well, let me try Logan. And so one's got Joe, one's got Logan, and here we go. We got this strategy being played. Now, as we get to the end of the game, and we've played this maybe 50 times or something, I don't know. You know, one of them might start to be thinking, aha, kind of like John Nash's aha moment in the bar. I know what I'm going to do. On the 100th time, I'm going to go high on the 100th time. All right, so I'm Coke, and I'm thinking on the 100th time, I'm going to take it down. And then Pepsi starts thinking, wait a second. That Coke executive's pretty smart. I bet they're thinking you're going to screw me over on the 100th time. I'm going to change on the 99th time. And then Coke starts thinking to himself, you know, Pepsi's pretty smart too. I bet he's thinking that I'm going to go on the 100th and he's going to go on the 90th. I'm going to go on the 98th time. And then Pepsi's thinking to himself, I bet he's thinking that I'm thinking that I'm going to go then, so I'm going to go on the 97th time. I bet he's thinking that I'm thinking that I'm going to go on the 96th time. 95, 94, 93, 92. I haven't done these exercises for a while. I used to do cardio sculpt. This is good for me. I should just keep doing this. 87, 86. Where's this game going? Where's the equilibrium strategy going to be after we think through that whole thought process? To go high, high. So using rational thinking in a finite, repeated game, so we're adding another layer of detail here. If we play this 100 times, the rational outcome would be for that thoughts that we all kind of feel good about to unravel to the 2020 solution again, and it would be right back to high, high would be the prediction. All right, so that's another issue. Rules of the game number 2. Is this a one-shot, believe it or not, this is not my terminology here, sometimes called a single shot, a one-shot game, in other words, we just play it one time. Is this a one-shot or repeated game? Is this a one-shot or repeated game? Now, instead of playing it 100 times, does it change your answer if we play it indefinitely? In other words, there is no ending time. We don't know when it is. We're just playing indefinitely. Companies tend to live forever, or big companies like Coke and Pepsi, even sometimes they die off, but we certainly don't have an end date necessarily set. Would that change things if we had no ending date? Kind of changes that unraveling thing, right? Now I can't say on the 100th time I'm going to screw you over because I don't know when that time is. And if we play indefinitely, the strategies could change. So that's another thing. If it's repeated, Is it finite or infinite? Infinite. And so infinite just means played indefinitely. In other words, we got no end in sight. Finite would be we play 100 times or 5 times or 6 times. That would be a finite repeated game. All right, so back to our game here. Let's say that this is a one-shot. So now we've got a non-cooperative one-shot game. Where are we going now? High? It becomes easier that we're not playing that game that I did with the repeated business any longer, right? So we're starting to look at high. Now, what if I had it taking turns? So instead of each choosing without knowing the others, we play what's called a sequential game. Coke goes first, let's say, and Pepsi goes second. If we make this a sequential game, does that change the answers? If Coke goes first, in other words, if you were Coke, which one would you pick? High. Why? Okay, so you bring up one of the interesting things with the logic is if you have the power, the first mover advantage, the ability to go first, what is the most important thing for you to focus on? Is it your outcomes? Your opponent's outcomes. That's kind of an interesting twist, is that I'm going to look at what is Pepsi going to choose is more important than what I want to choose. Because I might not ever get to this one. If this was 550, you're like, ooh, 550, I get to choose first. I'm going to go for the highest payoff. I'm going to choose low. Well, that would be a mistake if you didn't look at what your other players' outcomes were going to be. So by looking at that, we see that if Coke goes low, Pepsi's actually going to choose high. And if Coke goes high, Pepsi's going to choose high. So really, my only choice is, do I want 20 or do I want 0? The 550 that looks appealing and looks shiny and bright and a nice little golden nugget to chase after is actually not realistic when we put this rationality into trying to think through what our opponents are going to do. And that is capturing the strategic nature of this, right? Looking at what the other person's going to do, thinking about the rules of the game and how we should make a choice. All right, questions or comments there? All right, so let's add that to the mix here. Number 3, is the game sequential or simultaneous? So number 3, is the game sequential, parentheses, take turns. You go, then I go. Or simultaneous. The word simultaneous can be a little bit misleading too. Most of the time when we use the word simultaneous in normal talk, what does it mean? If people are doing something simultaneously, what are they doing? At the same time. Now, is that necessary here? No. So what's the key thing that needs to happen in order to call it a simultaneous game? What's the key part of that? No, not necessarily the same way. So when we think about people doing something simultaneously, we normally think about them doing it at the same time. But that's not the thing I'm after here. The other agents what? Can't know what the other person did, right? So it actually doesn't matter if Pepsi made their decision today and Coke makes their decision next Saturday. as long as Coke doesn't know what Pepsi did. Because if Coke knows what Pepsi did, we're back to a sequential game, right? So don't get lost in the timing aspect. It just means the simultaneous part here is that each player is making their choice without knowledge of the other's choice. So for simultaneous, each agent makes choice without knowledge of other's choice. As long as that goes on, the actual timing of it doesn't matter. Okay, so now for this game it didn't matter, but normally this would be a rule of the game that we need to know. And so for this game, let's say that we had a simultaneous, non-cooperative, one-shot game. Now we've identified the rules of the game, and we can try to figure out a solution. All right. So the first step that I like to do that you guys have, some of you have already done in your mind, but I want to formalize that, is to check for what's called a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is a choice that leaves a player better off regardless of what the other one chooses. And that's what was really going on here with Coke. Does Pepsi have a similar dominant strategy? Yeah. So with Pepsi, high leaves Pepsi better off regardless of what the other chooses. So how we formalize that is we say, if Coke goes high, what would Pepsi do? They'd go high. If Coke goes low, what would Pepsi do? Pepsi would go high. So in any circumstance, it's better for Pepsi to go high, and so we say that they have a dominant strategy. So let me write that out in some shorthand here. So let's put on here tips for solving games. Some tips for solving games. Number one, look for dominant strategies. A dominant strategy is a choice or strategy, but in this simpler model, it's easier to just think of a choice. A choice set such that I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said such that. Let's see, a choice set that, not such that. Come back to the set. A choice set that leaves a player, that leaves an agent or a player better off regardless of what the other chooses. A choice set that leaves an agent better off regardless of what the other chooses. So, looking for Pepsi. So for Pepsi, if Coke chooses high, so look at my shorthand notation here. If Coke chooses, so the arrow, the red arrow here is chooses. If Coke chooses high, then Pepsi should choose what? High. So if Coke chooses high, we can start to kind of blank out which one's which. Now, another tip for you, especially if you guys don't have colors, and sometimes the textbook might lay these out slightly different. We just need to identify each agent. But it might be helpful to circle one of the players, even if you got pencil. So Coke is the 20. Coke is always the first payoff in each one of the cells. And then your eyeball sees it a little easier, just to kind of differentiate the two. eventually, once you train yourself, it gets pretty easy. You'll start to see just the first payoff is always the other. Question?
So the one on the left is always going to be the first option.
The one on the left is on the left.
Yep.
Okay, and the top is right.
Yep. And then the top is right always. That is the setup of the model. Yes. Any other questions? All right. So for Pepsi, if Coke chooses high, then Pepsi chooses high. If Coke chooses low, then Pepsi chooses high. Therefore, Pepsi has a dominant strategy of high. Should choose high no matter what. So this is how, on a test, I would say, does either player have a dominant strategy? And you would say this. This is the way you're letting me know that you've kind of went through the test for dominant strategy. All right, questions on that? On your own, do the same thing for Coke. Why don't you guys go ahead and do it for Coke? You're going to lay it out the same way, except now you're going to say, if Pepsi chooses this, then what does Coke do? And just kind of lay that out. Lay out that argument. You can work with your neighbor. You can chat with your neighbor if you want. Everybody get it? Yes.
So that model is only held true if the agent we're picking for is the second.
If the agent is what?
I mean, it's
Oh.
all in regards if like Coke picks first or Pepsi picks first.
No, so yeah, you're bringing up a good point. We're kind of almost thinking of it like being sequential, but we're not. So, and maybe I'm reading you wrong here, but we're looking for the dominant strategy for Pepsi, and so we're just kind of thinking to ourselves, if Coke goes high, what would I do? If Coke goes low, what would I do? If it's the same choice no matter what, I have a dominant strategy. So I didn't understand what you were saying about whether the first or second. That really doesn't play a role. If it's different, you don't. That's right.
It's just a projection, all right.
Yeah. So we can change this. Maybe this would be a good exercise. How can I take away the dominant strategy? What would need to be done to the payoff matrix to take away that dominant strategy from Pepsi? So which one? Over here?
Or on Coke.
Or 25 or something?
Something that matches.
Or 100 or whatever. So maybe if we make it 80.
Doesn't have to at least just match the high point.
At least, yeah. So if this was 80, if Coke goes high, what is Pepsi going to do? Low, right? Just by changing one number out of this. Now, the name of the movie was what? A Beautiful Mind. Part of the reason we have that is that this was so awesome that I could teach this to most 5th or 6th graders, right? No offense, but this basic setup we could teach to some, people that are in 6th grade. But it is so rich and complex. All the stuff that we did kind of thinking about the dynamics of the game, that's what's beautiful about it. Sometimes the most beautiful things in math class are the simple ones, the ones that can be conveyed and be powerful, that you don't have to have a PhD to figure out the meaningfulness of it. There are 72 different permutations of what we just did. I've showed you 2. There's 72 permutations of this little 4-square box, little 4-square fun box that we just did. And so I've showed you 2. Changing this from 0 to 80 was 2 of them. There's 72 other ones. That's what's beautiful about it, that we've got something that's fairly simple, easy to pick up, but can be very complex and rich with information. Unlike the kink demand model is where we're kind of to contrast that a bit. Roger?
Bigger than this 4-square box.
No, it gets bigger, yes. So if we can have, well, we can get into multiple agents too. Then we're getting into more advanced topics. But we can add another choice on real easy. So I could make this 3 choices of high, low, or kind of real low. And then we just do this. And now we've got 3 choices. We can make this as big as we want to. There can be multiple choices. What's that?
What if you had 3 agents though?
3 agents, it gets a little harder to graph. But we could, yeah, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But you start graphing in 3 dimensions. But yeah, it can be applied to multiple agents too. Okay, but we won't do that in this class, I don't think at all. We won't have the 3-agent variety. So we'll try to keep things simple. This is principles class, but I think I mentioned it already. There's a game theory class that was being offered to get into some advanced topics in game theory. All right, so that is a dominant strategy. That's a good place to look. And I've already showed you that we might not have a dominant strategy. So then the next thing that you can look for is Nash equilibrium. So this is on the tip list, tip number 2, or concept number 2. Nash equilibrium. So named after John Nash, the guy we had the video on. His equilibrium concept that he came up with here was looking for something stable, that people wouldn't want to change their minds. So I think the generic definition I gave you a long time ago for equilibrium was a situation in which there's no tendency for change. Is kind of a nice general idea of equilibrium. If we have a supply and demand curve and we got equilibrium price and quantity, we expect the price to be here. And if nothing else changes, that would be the price, right? Until we have one of the shifters come in. So a situation in which there's no tendency for change. And that's a little bit of the insight that Nash brought to the table with this cooperative, or the game theory setup, whether it's cooperative or non-cooperative. So a Nash equilibrium is a choice combination. A choice combination such that neither agent or player, neither agent wishes to change their choice. His or her choice, better English. A choice combination such that neither agent wishes to change their choice, taking as given, and this is the part that's a little slippery to understand, taking as given the other's choice. So from our example, is high a Nash equilibrium? By this definition, is the solution of each player choosing high under this setting a Nash equilibrium? Yes. Part of that comes about from this dominant strategy that just happens to be the way that's set up. But to answer the question, it's a little bit different than a dominant strategy. So if you go to the solution set of high, the 2020 payoff, you can just ask yourself this question. Would Pepsi want to change their answer? Taking as given that Coke's going high, would Pepsi want to change? No, because 20 is greater than 0. Would Coke like to change its answer? No, because 20 is greater than 0, taking as given that Pepsi went with high. So we're kind of looking after the fact and saying, would anybody want to change? And looking for that stability. If neither player wants to change, it's kind of a stable solution, right? It's like neither one wants to change, so we've got what Nash called an equilibrium under those circumstances. Okay, questions or comments on that? So is it a Nash equilibrium? Yes. Neither Coke nor Pepsi would like to change. For Pepsi, 20 is greater than 0, and for Coke, 20 is greater than 0. If they changed, they would end up taking 0. They're not going to do that, so they don't want to. All right. Any other questions on that? So we got some concepts going here. If there's a dominant strategy, is there always a Nash equilibrium? I believe that's true. There's always a Nash equilibrium if there's possibly in higher dimensions that might not necessarily make a solution to Nash. I think that's true though. All right. So we're having so much fun. Let's do another one here. So let me tell you a story. It's a true story, by the way. I was teaching up at Iowa State University, and unlike Ottawa, they have large classes of 200 to 300 students. It was generally the size of the class that I taught there. And this was the final exam week, and I think I was given this test on a Wednesday. And I had teaching assistants, unlike Ottawa University. I had to, that would help me with proctoring and do some of the grading and stuff. But my teaching assistant noticed that there was a couple of people that looked a little mischievous, right? And so it's a large lecture hall, kind of stadium seating, and saw what he thought was maybe some cheating, but he didn't know for sure, of course. And so the guy got up, and it was a guy and a gal. The guy got up and dropped his paper off, and then after he left, my teaching assistant went and grabbed his paper and shoved it aside, because otherwise there'd be a pile of 200 people. He doesn't know who that person is, what their name is, or anything. So he went and astutely went and grabbed his paper and set it aside. And then about 20 minutes later, the gal came down, dropped off her paper. And then, of course, after she left, he set them aside. And they're looking at the papers, and it is almost word for word on the short answer portion. It's kind of similar to what you guys took with the short answer portion. And there was multiple choice portion, which was also almost identical. And so we're pretty sure that these guys were just point blank cheating, but the evidence was, not perfect. It wasn't like for sure you were cheating and I could bust you. So, being the economist I am, I decided to put a little of this game theory stuff to work. And so I called up the guy on Friday. Being the nice guy that I am, I waited till final exam week was done. I didn't do this on Wednesday so that they were freaked out. And so I called up the guy late Friday morning after final exams were done. And I said, hi, this is your economics professor, and I noticed there's some cheating going on here with final exam. And he's like, what? You know, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so I started laying out some of the possibilities and explained that there was, the person sitting next to you. And he's like, oh, I don't know who she is. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. And so I kind of kept pressuring him. And then, so what I said to him was, I said, listen, here's the deal. I appreciate honesty. Everybody makes mistakes. And so if you confess that you cheated, I'm just going to give you a D on this test. And we'll kind of let things go, even though the test itself was like a high B or A, for that matter, on how they performed. So, that would be your grade. But if you deny it and the other person confesses to it and says that you guys did it, then I'm going to reward that person for their honesty and give them the grade that they deserved, and I'm going to fail you for the whole course, not just this test. So that's kind of how I set it up, and he just said, man, I'm not gonna tell you something I didn't do. I didn't lie, or I didn't cheat, and I don't even know who this person is. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll get back with you. So I hung up the phone, and then I called up. Let's call her Stacy. I called up Stacy, kind of gave her the same routine. Hey, I've noticed cheating, and I appreciate honesty. And she's like, oh, really? I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. Well, here's the way it's going to work, and explain the whole grading system. And then I kind of kept saying, well, if that other person gets the failing grade, and this could be a big deal for you guys. I'm going to turn you over to administration and whatnot. And I just kind of kept, laying it on, the penalties and the wrongness and all that. And then there was this little crack in your voice. I'm sorry, I've never cheated before in my life, and I decided to fix it all up. And I'm like, yes, I broke her. And so I got her to crack, and the case was cracked. So I got somebody to confess to the crime, and I kind of set it up. So the game that I set up was something like this. We had Stacy over here, Stacy and Paul, and each one had an opportunity to either confess or deny. Confess or deny. And remember, I didn't have perfect evidence on all of this. And so if they both denied, I might have just had to give them what they deserved on the test. Now, if they both confessed with their honesty, I would just give them the D on that exam. If one person denied and the other person confessed, so if Stacy confessed and Paul denied, then I'm going to reward Stacy with the A and give Paul the F.
You can give them all that option though?
Yeah, I gave them both the options. I gave them all the same options. So if one person confessed and the other didn't, if Paul confessed and Stacy lied, then I'm going to give Paul the A, and Stacy's going to get the F. And with F here, I mean fail the course, right? This is the big F, and get reported to the administration, all that stuff.
But you didn't give them the deny. You left that.
Yeah, you let that in the story.
Right. It was just part of the story the way I wielded it. Yes. So I didn't quite give them point blank that option. So this was just using a little bit of leverage on my part, I guess, on that. So I got my confession. What do you think? Paul denied. Stacy confessed. Now in confessing, she said, I don't even know who that guy is. I've never met him before in my life. Because I kind of wanted to figure out, going into the situation, did I know if they were boyfriend, girlfriend? Or from the same hometown, or best friends, best buddies, whatever, or whether they're complete strangers? I had no idea. And so during her confession, among the tears that were spilled, she told me that she had no clue who he was and that he was innocent. And from Paul's confession, he didn't allude to anything that he knew who she was. He seemed like, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, he was completely out of it. So, following my rules here, I gave Stacy the A, and Paul got sent down the river.
Did he know, or was she cheating on him right away?
Who knows? I just had to follow the rules of my own game, right?
So what is
Paul come back?
That's because you don't know
Just know.
All right, so by the way, this is a true story. I did not make this up, but it is based off of a famous article, a journal article, a concept called the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma. Now, you might have saw this in some other classes. Now that I call it the prisoner's dilemma, does that ring a bell for anybody?
Yeah.
Usually a few people have heard about the prisoner's dilemma. And police officers do this a lot, right? What do they do if you guys are in trouble? Hopefully none of you in this class have been in trouble. But if you get busted with your buddies, what do the police do to you?
They are your probation.
What's the first thing they do when they come upon you and there's two of you? They separate you, right? So they separate you, right? So they don't know maybe how well you know each other or other things, and they don't know how much evidence, but they can try to see if they can get a confession by doing what? What's their trick that they do to try to get a confession? I'm going to get the person, I'm going to give you a lighter sentence. Hey, I can probably just get you off with probation. You know, if you confess to this, appreciate your honesty, blah, blah, blah. It's the same old line that they're giving in hopes that they're going to get a confession. Now, if Paul would have been a different person, could he have felt pressured to confess to a crime he didn't commit? Possibly, right? Have you heard about stories like that on Dateline NBC and other things where people say that they never did it? In fact, once some new technology comes along with DNA evidence and stuff, that there's been some people that have been locked up for 9, 10, 15 years for a murder that they claim they didn't commit, but they got, through a jury of their peers, they got busted. Yeah, that kind of stuff happens, right? And so it might be possible through our system of playing the prisoner's dilemma that there's incentive for you to confess to something you didn't do. And so they say, hey, if you get prosecuted on this, you're going to get 20 years in prison, or take this 5-year sentence. And they're like, geez, nice choices, right? The prisoner's dilemma. All right, so that's a game theory tactic. Did I actually send Paul down the river? I love to hold you guys in suspense. I did let Paul off the hook, and I didn't penalize him at all for it. And Stacy I sent down the river. She did not get her A. And again, you guys kind of saw it. I didn't really give them that choice to begin with, so they didn't really know how much evidence I had. And by the way, it was really a pathetic case of copying too. I tried to embellish the story a little bit to make some sense, but she copied them like almost word for word on every short answer problem. I mean, just word for word, and so it was. Stacy could have done a much better job of cheating, is the moral of the story. And she wouldn't have found herself in this hot water. Okay, so this is the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma. And the dilemma is that the dilemma is that the criminal would be better off. Would be better off denying the charges. All right, so denying the charges, but does not know how much he or she can trust the other criminal. Each one is presented the same payoff matrix, and so they know that, well, that person's got incentive to confess too. Screw it, I'm just going to confess. That dirty, rotten scoundrel's not going to do it. Or were they best friends growing up, and how much do we actually trust that person? Because we'd both be better off if we keep our mouth shut and deny that we'll have a better outcome. So that's the dilemma. All right. This is the prisoner's dilemma. So we call it the prisoner's dilemma when the payoff structure is such that the predicted outcome of Nash equilibrium with the dominant strategies give you a worse outcome than another choice. So this is the prisoner's dilemma. I just gave it to you in a different form. Right? So in general, when we see a game that has this type of structure where we're going to get the not so good outcome, then that's called the prisoner's dilemma. One of the 72 permutations that we have with the game theory setup. Okay. Let me put one last bullet here. The payoffs are structured for dominant strategy of confess for each. But I got to tell you, it was very rewarding for me after teaching this for so many years to actually apply it, right? I took the economic model, and you guys saw how I twisted it, right? Again, when we look at reality versus an economic model, I kind of had to play it by ear. When I got these people on the phone, I didn't know if they were, kissing cousins or if they were complete strangers. So it's kind of a game that you got to play a little bit. But I had this as the background. This was the economic model that I had in the back of my mind of how to approach it and set up to try to get the truth, to pull the truth. All right, so let's see, what's up next here? We've got, I'm going to go ahead and erase this now. So we've got two star-crossed lovers, young 20-somethings, Chris and Pat, and they're trying to decide what they want to do for date night. This Saturday, there are two big-time deals that are one-time only in town. The Russian Ballet is in town, featuring the star of the Russian Ballet that's never been in Kansas City before. And then it just so happens that the Ultimate Fighting 177 is in town with the two biggest hombres that anybody's seen. It's the fight we've all been waiting for. So we have choices of going to the ballet or go to the fights for Chris and Pat. And this is how it shakes out here. So we've got Chris and we got Pat, and each one of them is going to need to choose whether they go to the ballet or the fights. Now, being new lovers, you guys have hopefully been there at some point in your life, they like to do things together, right? So the thought of being apart just is devastating. And so here's how that shakes out in the payoffs. If they both go to the ballet, Chris gets 2 units of satisfaction, 2 units of utility, and Pat gets 3. If they go to the fights, Chris gets 3 units of satisfaction, and Pat gets 2. If Chris goes to the ballet and Pat goes to the fights, they each get 0 units of satisfaction. If Chris goes to the fights and Pat goes to the ballet, they each get 1 unit of satisfaction. Where do we go? Wherever the girl wants to go. Who said there's any girls involved here? Boy, in today's day and age, I didn't think there'd be gender biases out here, and with homosexuality and transgender issues on campus. I said this was Chris and Pat. I didn't say it was anything to do with the girl-guy thing. So, all right, let's raise ourselves to a higher level in this economic model. Where's this young couple, 2 star-crossed lovers? Where are they going to go? They're not going. Watch a movie. All right, let's get back to our economics of trying to deduce this. What's my first tip for you? Check for dominant strategy. Go. Is there a dominant strategy? Is there a dominant strategy? So you should be writing on your paper what the dominant strategy. This could be a test question. Is there a dominant strategy? If your answer is no, that's fine, but you need to show your work. Show your work.
Show it because it's like.
We got your notes? I gave it to you earlier. Are you not writing down? Oh, you're breaking cardinal rule. What we just wrote earlier today. So it's the one that goes if. If Coke goes this, then Pepsi does this. Doesn't look like you did that part. Okay, you guys, remember I mean, you don't have to do it. You're not going to lose any points for it. But if I write it on the board, what do I suggest you do?
Write it down.
You write it down on your paper.
There's no dominant strategy.
No dominant strategy. Where's your work? Show your work. That will cost you points on the test. So show your work. Yep, that's what you want to do. And then show both. Yes, that's right. You want to do it for each agent. So 1 for Chris, 1 for Pat. And this is the one where it starts off the if. Did you write down that before? So it's the one where so did you not write that down with the if then? Did everybody get on the sign-in sheet? Okay. Get it started. So this is the one to go. If Chris goes ballet, what should Pat do? If Chris goes fight. So it's if Chris does ballet, if Chris does fights. If we're not trying to figure out the Pat. All right, so dominant strategy. No, why? All right. So I'm not gonna write it down on the board. You guys should be able to pick that up exactly from what I gave you before, but let's walk through the logic. If I'm checking for a dominant strategy for Pat, I say if Chris goes ballet, what should Pat do? Ballet, and again, you might want to circle the payoffs to make it easier to interpret. 3 is greater than 0, so Pat would choose ballet. So if Chris goes ballet, Pat goes ballet. If Chris goes fight, then you can kind of delete these. If Chris goes fight, what's Pat going to do? Fight, because 2 is greater than 1.
Do we have to say that part and then we have to write down because 2 is greater than 1?
No, you don't have to get into that one. Just as long as I see you got the logic of if Chris goes this. So at the end of the day, you get a different answer, right? And so therefore, no dominant strategy for Pat. Did I hear a question? Was somebody saying a question? No? So then to check for Chris, we say if Pat goes ballet, what's Chris going to choose? Ballet, because 2 is greater than 1. Again, you kind of got to train your eye. This is eyeball training is what I call it. You guys got to kind of remember which one's which. If Pat goes with the fights, what's Chris going to do? The fights, because 3 is greater than 0. Therefore, Chris also is going to choose a different option depending on what Pat does. So in this game, there are no dominant strategies. Tip number 2. What's tip number 2 on the tip list of solving games? Nash equilibrium. Is there any Nash equilibrium? You asked before if there's dominant strategies, is there a Nash equilibrium? Now we know there's no dominant strategies, but is there Nash equilibriums? See some no's? Nash equilibrium definition is what? Choice combination. Neither agent wants to change. Taking is given. So what you can do for a Nash is pick any old combination, I don't care which one, and start asking yourself, would so-and-so like to change her mind? So let's take this one. Would Chris like to change his or her mind? Yes, because 2 is greater than 1. As soon as you find that at least one person wants to switch, then you know it's not a Nash equilibrium, right? Because it says at least one player, right? So all it takes is one player wanted to switch. Now, let's come up to this one. Would Chris like to change his or her mind?
Yes. Yeah.
Would Chris like to change his or her mind?
No.
No, because 2 is greater than 1. It's just the opposite of the logic we just did. So Chris is fine. Would Pat like to change his or her mind? No. Because 3 is greater than 0. Nash equilibrium. A choice combination such that neither player wants to change their mind, taking as given what the other has chosen.
So you just need to find one box that has Nash equilibrium.
Wait, isn't that Nash equilibrium?
Okay, so we can do this for other boxes. Let's go down to, well, let's take this box. Let's do them all since this is the first time. Would Pat like to change his or her mind?
Yes.
Yes, so it's not a Nash. Would Pat like to change his or her mind? No, 2 is greater than 1. Would Chris like to change his or her mind? No, because 3 is greater than 0. Well, there's an interesting one. Now we've learned that it's possible to have multiple equilibria, the plural for equilibrium. It's possible to have multiple solutions in game theory. That is a little bit of a stretch from the old supply and demand where we had P star. That was our solution, our equilibrium. Now we actually have 2 outcomes that are Nash equilibrium. Uh-oh. You can pull that thing down.
So basically that's just saying as long as the other thing is happy.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of saying as long as they're together, then that's a stable, it's a stable outcome. So now, back to the question of the day. So this is, by the way, the little shorthand notation. We just put a little n up in the upper right-hand corner to denote the Nash equilibrium. So back to my question of the day. What are we doing? What's our young couple going to do? Either or? Both. Can we do both? Go to the first half of the ballet and then intermission, go run across the street to the other half of the UFC. We kind of, yeah, that's true. Might have the main event. So reality could come in and we could start talking about that, right? If there was real world. Now, what are some other real world negotiations that could go on between Pat and Chris on whether we go to the fights or whether we go to the ballet? Whoever wears the pants, okay? Who's the better negotiator, maybe? Price. So let's talk about price, because that's certainly worth mentioning, because this kind of comes back to that whole MU divided by P business, right? Marginal utility per dollar, where's the biggest bang for the buck? So that is completely worthwhile. If the fights are half as much as the ballet or something, let's just say that these payoffs are bang for the buck already. So this was, I factored that in, let's say. This is the marginal utility per dollar. Great point to bring up, though. That would be important. Yeah?
You go back to the rules, and is this a one-shot deal or?
Good. That's important, too. It is a one-shot. So it's that's why I was trying to build up the thing with it's Saturday, one night only, never been to Kansas City before, right? So we're thinking a one-shot game, yes.
If Pat stands up Chris or Chris stands up Pat.
If one of them stands up the other?
Yeah, because that's like a 0-0 comes into play then.
Yeah, so would that be an outcome, though? Would you predict that we would get to one of these corners? No.
Doing it together.
Not with the Star-Crossed Lovers cooperative game, right? So we have a cooperative, one-shot game, simultaneous game. Actually, it could almost be sequential if we wanted to. One would follow the other. So a sequential game, we'd actually get one of these outcomes too. Maybe somebody said, "Where's the pants?" So whoever says, "I don't care what you're doing, I'm going to the fights." Well, it turns out the one with the lesser pants would probably go to the fights too, because it would be in their interest to, right? They might throw up a threat of, "Hey, I'm going to the ballet, I don't care what you're doing." But at the end of the day, if these are their true feelings, if this is their true utility functions, that was a bluff. That was a bluff. That was part of negotiations. And so now we start getting into some other areas of whether there's credible bluffs or not in strategies. This is starting to get deeper. I'm just kind of sprinkling out little thoughts of how this stuff's pretty darn cool, actually. And we can start to analyze those things. Nobody brought up a side payment. Young couple, madly in love, you guys can use your imaginations what a side payment might be able to be. Did you say that? I usually have somebody say that. Right, so, hey, I'll go to the ballet, but what are you going to do for me? Right? So that could enter in, and now we can start to analyze how much would that side payment need to be for that person to find it beneficial to go. 1 unit of utility, right? Well, what is that utility function? What are we measuring on those axes again? We got the fights and we got some other pleasure center on the other part. I don't know what it is. You guys use your imagination. But that could be all part of the negotiations. So as we start to talk this through, even though this is very simple, we can start to get more and more complex. That's kind of the beautiful mind part again. This sets up some neat stuff for us to do. All right. What do you think this couple would really do in reality? Let's. I mean, we talked about some things, negotiations, but if we throw negotiations and side payments out the door, what would be another fair thing that each one would say, that sounds fair. Let's do it. Flip a coin. That turns out to be another equilibrium called a mixed strategy equilibrium. That's another solution to this particular game, the way the payoff structures are, is that we could flip a coin and let Lady Luck determine where we're going to go. So that's yet another possibility, is to flip a coin. Okay, so what do we get from this? Well, although there's multiple equilibrium, we were at least able to rule out, from an economist standpoint, making predictions, that the two would go to different events. And that even though one might have some cheap talk and try to bluff with some cheap talk, that wouldn't be the solution that we'd actually end up observing in all likelihood. So, so there are 2 Nash equilibrium. 2 Nash equilibrium. So we are able to eliminate some outcomes through analyzing the payoffs. So that's the benefit here, just using game theory. We didn't come to maybe a specific solution value, but we were able to come up with something. All right, so I didn't even write any of this out, did I? I was telling the story, I was so wrapped up, so let me write down the story so if you guys review your notes here for later. So here's our example. Chris and Pat are madly in love. And enjoy doing things together. So the choice is the fights or ballet. The fights or the ballet. And the payoffs are marginal utility per dollar. There, I was able to sneak in a few extra things here. So, again, one of the things that makes this so robust is that we got away from profits, didn't we? Now we're bringing in this other concept of utility that we spent a lot of time on. So our payoff matrix can be multiple things. Could be profits, could be revenues, could be any sort of outcome that we can get our hands on. All right, so let me write down a few more things here. So, who is the fight liker? We didn't really talk about this yet. Who's the fight liker? Why? How do you know that?
Maybe he's not the fight liker, but you enjoy it more than you enjoy the ballet.
All right. We kind of see that in the payoffs, right? Because look at the utility values. If they go to different places, Chris and Pat going to opposite events get some satisfaction, right? Because it's the thing they kind of like a little bit better. And the same thing was going on with their payoffs, that Chris got a little bit more satisfaction from going to the fights with the 3 versus the 2. So who is the fight liker? Chris. By looking at the payoffs. And how will this be settled? Well, we don't know. We could possibly flip a coin. Would be one reasonable way to come up with where we actually go in terms of kind of fairness. We could introduce things like side payments. We could introduce side payments. There could be other things of alternating if we were doing, something later, but we generically just call that side payment. What was the other thing we had? Because the side payment could be, let's just put on here, money or gifts. Gifts of utility, favors, gifts or services. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday. Oh yeah, I'm glad you brought up the video. Let's bring it up Wednesday. Yeah, yep. And I might have even another. Thinking about another option that might be kind of fun too.